We usually try to figure out why something happens by looking at the thing itself.
Yeah, the individual action.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Why did this person do that? But what if we zoomed out, way out, and looked at the whole landscape around them?
The context.
That's sort of our mission today, to see how your surroundings can be this surprisingly powerful force in shaping behavior, even something as serious as crime.
It's a really different lens, like looking at the whole ecosystem, not just the fish, as you said before we started.
Right. Is the water quality off?
Yeah.
What else is going on? That broader view. Sometimes that's where the real insights are.
Absolutely. And that's really the core of what we call social theories of crime. They shift our attention, away from just individual psychology or biology.
And focus more
On the impact of the social environment, it's about recognizing that the conditions where people live, work, interact,
mm.
they can fundamentally influence their actions, including crime.
Okay, and this isn't some brand new idea, is it? I was reading that way back, 1800s, people were already connecting crime to where people lived. Tell us about these early crime maps. Sounds pretty forward-thinking.
It really was. What's fascinating is that as early as the 1830s, you had researchers in France. André Michel Gary is a key name.
Gary, okay.
They were pioneers. They were using this new statistical data that was becoming available to actually create maps showing crime concentration.
Wow. Data mapping in the 1830s.
Yeah. And what made Gary's work so insightful was that he layered this crime data with other social info, things like education levels, even rates of births outside marriage.
Huh. So he was connecting the dots.
He was. He was one of the first to visually show that crime wasn't just random bad luck. It tended to cluster in areas with specific social characteristics.
Yeah.
A real early example of using data to see those bigger societal patterns.
So even then, the idea that your environment has a real impact was starting to kind of click. And this concept, looking beyond the individual, seeing these bigger patterns,
Yeah.
that ties into something called the sociological imagination, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
That aha moment.
Exactly. C. Wright Mills introduced the idea. He urged us to look beyond our own personal bubbles, our own, immediate troubles, and question the things we take for granted.
Right.
And social theories of crime are a perfect example. They push us to ask, what are the larger social structures, the cultural norms, the institutions?
Right.
What role might they be playing in what we even define as crime?
So it connects your own little corner of the world to these wider forces.
That's it. That moment where you realize a problem you thought was purely personal might actually be a symptom of something much bigger in society.
Okay, so we're shifting focus away from just blaming the individual, looking at the bigger picture. Now, you mentioned there are different flavors of these social theories.
Yeah, quite a range.
Some focus close up, others are more zoomed out, like whole political systems.
Yeah, exactly. If you think about it like a continuum, on one end, you've got the micro-level theories. They look at your immediate relationships, family, friends, school, how those influence you.
Okay.
Then on the other end, the macro level. That's where theories examine large-scale forces like government, the economy, how they shape crime rates across society.
And there are different focuses too, right? Like strain or control.
Right. You have theories focusing on the stress and frustration people feel. That's social strain theory. Maybe that pushes them towards crime. And then others flip it. They ask why most people don't break the law.
Well,
Those focus on things like social bonds, self-control. That's social control theory.
got it. A whole toolbox then for understanding the social side of crime.
That's a good way to put it.
And for our deep dive today, we're pulling out one specific tool, social disorganization theory. What's the headline on this one? The core idea.
The central idea is, well, pretty straightforward. The level of order or maybe disorder in a neighborhood directly affects the behavior of the people living there.
Okay, so order matters.
It really matters. In communities struggling with, say, high poverty, lots of people moving in and out all the time, weak local institutions.
Like struggling schools, or maybe just not many active community groups.
Exactly that. In those places, the theory says you tend to see higher rates of crime. It argues that this breakdown, this social disorganization, makes it tough for the community to kind of look out for itself and prevent crime effectively.
Okay, let's dig into this social disorganization idea more. You mentioned it really got going in the early 20th century with sociology taking off. What was the basic thinking about society back then that kind of set the stage?
Well, back in the 1920s, a really common idea in sociology was that society worked because people generally agreed on things. There was a consensus about acceptable behavior.
Like what?
Simple stuff, like we all agree to drive on a certain side of the road.
Mm.
Or red means stopped. It creates order, predictability. And this idea of shared norms, it extended to more serious things too, like the general agreement that, stealing is wrong, violence is wrong. This shared understanding was seen as the bedrock, the glue holding society together.
But then things changed dramatically. Cities just exploded in size. How did that massive urbanization shift how people thought about crime?
That's a key point. The massive and really rapid growth of cities, late 19th, early 20th century, it really shook things up. People were pouring into urban centers for factory work,
Right.
leading to these incredibly diverse, often really overcrowded, and frankly, often very poor living conditions. This rapid change made criminologists start to wonder.
What was this new environment doing?
Exactly. Was it a melting pot of opportunity? Or were the overcrowding, the hardship, maybe breeding conflict, distrust, and ultimately more crime?
And Chicago became this key place for studying all this, right? Like a living laboratory.
Absolutely. Chicago in the early 20th century saw just unprecedented population growth, industry, immigration. It was booming.
So everything was changing really fast.
Completely reshaped how people lived and interacted. So for the researchers at the University of Chicago, people like Park and Burgess, they had this incredible real-time chance to study these massive social changes and their impact on crime right there on their doorstep.
Perfect storm for research in a way.
It really was. This
Yeah.
urban laboratory became the birthplace for some of the most influential social theories of crime. And social disorganization theory was right there at the start.
Okay, so out of this Chicago school, as it's called, came Robert Park. What was his angle, his contribution to this developing idea?
Robert Park was a major figure. He brought in ideas from human ecology.
Human ecology, like how animals interact with their environment.
Kind of, yeah. He argued that just like in nature, there's competition in cities, competition for resources, for space. And he believed these economic pressures, this constant competition, really affected how people behaved day to day.
Interesting. And then Ernest Burgess built on Park's work with his famous concentric zone theory. Can you paint a picture of that for us? What did the city look like according to Burgess?
Sure. Burgess observed that cities didn't just sprawl randomly, they tended to grow outwards, almost like ripples in a pond, in a series of concentric circles.
Okay, circles.
He identified 5 main zones. Zone 1, right in the middle, was the central business district, downtown, commerce, offices.
Got it.
Right around that was Zone 2. He called it the zone of transition. This was a really dynamic area, constantly changing. Because it was often where newcomers first landed, lots of people moving in, often poor, maybe recent immigrants, but also people moving out as soon as they could afford to, heading towards better areas. So high turnover.
At a constant flux.
Exactly. Then you had zones 3, 4, and 5 moving further out. These were more stable residential areas, often getting progressively wealthier and less crowded as you moved away from the center. Zone 3, working class homes. Zone 4, middle class. Zone 5, commuter zone, suburbs.
And Burgess found something really specific about crime and these zones, right? It wasn't just spread evenly.
Not at all. That was the key finding. Burgess consistently found that Zone 2, that zone of transition, had the highest crime rates year after year.
The highest rates were stuck in that one zone.
Pretty much. And the insight here, which was pretty radical then, was that crime seemed tied to the place, not necessarily just the people who happened to be living there at that moment. He saw a strong link. High poverty, high residential turnover, high crime rates, all concentrated in Zone 2.
So it wasn't about, say, a specific ethnic group living there causing crime, because the groups changed over time.
That's what Shaw and McKay looked at next. They took Burgess's theory and really tested it.
Right, Clifford Shaw and Henry McKay. How did they test it?
They went deep into Chicago. They meticulously mapped the home addresses of thousands of young people who had gone through the juvenile court system.
Wow, detailed work.
Very. And their findings. They overwhelmingly backed up Burgess. They consistently found the highest rates of delinquency clustered right there in zones 1 and 2, the business district and that transition zone.
And this held true over time.
That's the crucial part. It held steady over decades, even as the ethnic and racial makeup of those zones completely changed. Different groups moved in, others moved out, but the high delinquency rate stayed put in those areas.
That's huge. The people change, but the crime rate in the place doesn't. That really hammers home the environment argument.
It really does. It strongly suggested that something about the characteristics of those zones themselves was driving the high crime rates.
And this is where they coined the term social disorganization. What did they mean by that, specifically?
Precisely. Sean McKay used social disorganization to describe that cluster of characteristics they kept seeing in zones 1 and 2. Low socioeconomic status, meaning poverty. High ethnic heterogeneity, meaning lots of different groups living close together, maybe without shared traditions yet. High residential mobility, that constant turnover we talked about.
Poverty, diversity, transience.
And high crime rates, of course. They argued that these conditions together made it really hard for communities to form strong social bonds, develop shared values, or create effective ways to, informally keep things in line, like neighbors watching out for each other.
So the community couldn't effectively police itself in a way.
Exactly. The mechanisms for informal social control were weakened. And that, they argued, led to higher crime.
Okay. Now let's jump forward a bit. Robert Sampson comes along later, 1970s, and revisits these ideas.
Yes, Sampson did really important work building on this foundation. He used survey data, actually from Britain initially, and his findings essentially confirmed the link. Neighborhoods with more signs of social disorganization tended to have higher crime rates.
So more evidence supporting the core idea.
Yes, but he also added a really crucial concept: collective efficacy.
Collective efficacy, what's that?
It's basically about social cohesion combined with shared expectations for social control. Think of it as, do neighbors trust each other? Do they share common values about keeping the neighborhood safe and orderly? And crucially, are they willing to actually step in and do something for the common good, like intervene if kids are skipping school or vandalizing property?
So it's not just about not being disorganized. It's about actively being organized and trusting each other.
Exactly. Sampson showed that this collective efficacy was a powerful protective factor. Even in disadvantaged neighborhoods, communities with higher collective efficacy tended to have lower crime rates. It acted like a buffer.
That's a really important nuance. It's not just about the bad stuff present, but the good stuff, the community strength that might be missing or present.
Precisely.
And Sampson's later studies, like the Great American City Effect study you mentioned, they found this elsewhere too, not just Chicago or Britain.
Yes, his 2012 study and other research in places like Sweden and Australia have consistently backed this up. Neighborhoods with stronger collective efficacy generally have lower crime, even when you control for poverty levels.
So the idea holds up internationally too.
It seems to. It really solidified the idea that social cohesion, that ability of a community to act together, is a critical factor.
Okay, so we've got a solid grasp of the theory and its development. Let's put on critical thinking hats now, evaluate it a bit. What are the logical strengths? What did it really get right?
Well, a major strength, logically, was that huge shifting perspective, moving away from just blaming individuals and really highlighting the neighborhood's role. That was big.
Yeah, focusing on the environment.
And grounding it in actual data. That early Chicago research pushed criminology towards being more empirical, more evidence-based, showing crime stayed put even when people changed. That made a powerful case that place matters.
And it influenced policy too, right?
Absolutely. It directly led to thinking about neighborhood revitalization and community building as crime prevention strategies. That's a practical strength.
But like any theory, it's not perfect. What are some of the logical weaknesses or critiques? Where does it fall short?
That's right. One common critique is that it can sometimes, perhaps, downplay individual factors too much.
Like personality or resilience?
Exactly. Mental health, personal choices, resilience. Not everyone in a disorganized area gets involved in crime. Most don't. So the theory doesn't fully explain individual differences.
Okay, what else?
Another point is its focus. It tends to zoom in on the immediate neighborhood, the micro level. Sometimes it doesn't fully connect that to the larger historical forces or political decisions.
Like systemic racism or redlining or big economic shifts that create those neighborhood conditions in the first place.
Precisely. It sometimes lacks that broader macro-level context. It might explain what the neighborhood is like, but not always why it got that way due to larger forces.
Yet I can see how focusing heavily on street crime in poorer areas could be problematic.
That's a significant criticism. The theory developed by studying delinquency and street crime in these specific urban zones.
So it risks ignoring other types of crime, like white-collar crime.
Potentially, yes. It could inadvertently reinforce stereotypes about certain communities and certain types of crime, while maybe overlooking harms caused elsewhere, perhaps by corporate decisions or government policies.
And could it lead to things like discriminatory policing, focusing enforcement on those areas?
That's a concern critics raise, definitely. There's also some fuzziness about the exact mechanisms. How exactly does disorganization lead to crime? Is it poverty creating necessity? Is it the rise of deviant subcultures? Is it simply that those areas are policed more heavily, leading to more arrests? The theory isn't always crystal clear on the specific causal links.
Right. And you mentioned earlier it struggles with the rare event problem.
Yes, crime, even in high crime areas, is still statistically rare relative to the population. Most people, even in the toughest neighborhoods, are not committing crimes. The theory has a harder time explaining why the majority resist, focusing more on why the minority offend.
So it's foundational, provides key insights, but maybe needs to be part of a bigger picture.
I think that's fair. It's a really important piece of the puzzle, but not the whole puzzle.
Okay, logically it has strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah.
What about validity? Does the actual evidence, the research over the years, generally support the theory?
Empirically, I'd say the support is mixed, but generally meaningful. Some early studies had methodological issues, maybe defining disorganization loosely.
But more recent research.
More recent, rigorous research has largely confirmed the core relationship. Neighborhoods with higher levels of measurable social disorganization do tend to have higher crime rates. That central finding holds up pretty well.
And that consistency about the transition zones, the original zones 1 and 2, does that still hold?
Yes, the finding that crime tends to concentrate in areas with high poverty, high mobility, and often high diversity. Those core characteristics of the original transition zone that's been replicated many times in many cities.
And that 1995 Chicago study by Sampson, Rodenbush, and Earls you mentioned, that was key for validity.
It was really significant, yes. They looked at Chicago neighborhoods again, but with more sophisticated methods. They identified what they called concentrated disadvantage, combining poverty, racial segregation, population density, etc.
A more nuanced measure of disadvantage.
Exactly. And they confirmed its link to violence. But crucially, they also measured collective efficacy directly.
And found it mattered.
They found it mattered a lot. Even in areas with high concentrated disadvantage, neighborhoods that scored higher on collective efficacy, that trust and willingness to intervene, had significantly lower rates of violence.
So community strength can buffer the negative effects.
That's what their evidence strongly suggested. It showed that social organization, or rather collective efficacy, isn't just the flip side of disadvantage. It's an independent factor that has its own impact. This really refined the theory and boosted its validity.
So modern research has kind of sharpened the focus, showing it's not just about disorder, but also about the presence or absence of that community glue, that collective efficacy.
Well put. Yes.
Okay, final angle, utility. How is this theory actually useful? What does it tell us to do about crime? How does it differ from other approaches?
Its utility lies in its unique approach to crime control. Think about other theories. Classical theories might focus on deterrence, making punishments harsher. Biological theories might look for treatments.
Right.
Social disorganization theory says the key is to improve the social environment, fix the conditions that breed crime. It sees crime as a symptom of a struggling community.
So change the place, not just punish the person.
Fundamentally, yes.
And the Chicago Area Project, which Sean McKay started themselves, that was putting this into practice early on.
Exactly. CAP was groundbreaking. It wasn't about building more jails in Zone 2. It was about investing in Zone 2.
How?
They set up youth programs, recreational activities, trying to organize local residents to work on community problems, mediate disputes. The goal was to rebuild those social structures, foster local leadership, create that informal social control from within.
Which sounds a lot like building collective efficacy, even before Sampson formally named it.
Absolutely, it aligns perfectly. The idea is that crime control isn't just a police job. It's a social task, a community responsibility.
So in terms of policy today, this theory would suggest investing in things like
Better housing, improving schools, creating job opportunities, supporting local organizations, building parks, things that strengthen the community fabric.
things that give people a stake in the neighborhood and connect them to each other.
Precisely. It encourages building social cohesion and fostering that informal social control rather than relying solely on, say, increased surveillance or incarceration. It's about proactive community building.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up then. The core idea of social disorganization theory. Our surroundings, our environment, deeply influence behavior.
Right.
And crime is more likely, where you have that mix of poverty, instability, people moving in and out, and weak community bonds.
A breakdown in that informal social control, yes.
It offers this different perspective, moving beyond just the individual offender, and suggests that tackling crime means strengthening the social fabric of neighborhoods.
Building that collective efficacy.
And while it's got criticisms maybe too focused on street crime, doesn't always account for individual differences or larger structural forces. The research, especially around collective efficacy, gives a pretty solid backing. The idea that where you live matters holds strong.
That's a great summary. And it's important to remember it doesn't mean people are just puppets, right? Individuals still make choices. But the theory powerfully shows how the social context shapes the options, the challenges, the opportunities, and ultimately influences the likelihood of crime.
So here's something for you, our listener, to think about. Considering this environmental perspective, this focus on social organization, what are some maybe unexpected ways that the organization or maybe the disorganization of your own community or even just your daily surroundings might be subtly shaping behavior?
Yeah, not just crime, but other aspects of life, too.
Exactly. How did the social aspects of where you are, how things are structured around you, influence your individual experiences in ways you might not even normally notice?
I'm all over.